So what do we actually do? The four main areas. We will assess the mitigation options for CCS and characterise in terms of their potential to reduce CO2. As we do look at other sort of gases as well, but CO2 is sort of the main focus. On the more technical side, we'll look at track the capture technology cost in terms of costs and energy. Penalties. And on the storage side, we will monitor performance and report to our members on the mechanical integrity of reservoirs. And as we've sort of touched on briefly, we'll provide members and policy audience with independent technical information. And just briefly there, you can see sort of the breadth of our membership. It's a very strong membership with a lot of 18 countries and a lot of big companies involved there. And along the bottom, we have memorandums of understanding with the groups at the bottom. Right. I'm not going to embarrass Tim by reading his entire biography. He is really a man who needs no introduction. I will now pass you over to our very own Tim Dixon to take you through COP21 and CCS.
Okay, thank you very much, Sean, and good day to you all, and thank you very much for joining us. This is really as much a personal reflection on COP21. As you're probably all aware, this is a very significant event with a lot of effort and work had gone into it, and a lot of implications and a lot of the details still to be determined and worked through. But this is just a quick summary, really from our point of view. And as Sean described the nature of our program, we work on technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the use of fossil fuels. So we live in the mitigation part of the climate change world. And of course, COP21 and the Paris Agreement contains a lot about the adaptation and impacts as well. But this perspective is from the mitigation perspective that we live in. And as Sean said, one of our roles is to make sure that our technical program, the information from that, gets used appropriately to inform policy and regulatory developments. And so that's why we are involved in the UNFCCC meetings in the first place, is really to provide this technical evidence base to help the overall processes. So just to take us back then, really, as background, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change started in 1992 and it was basically around agreeing that man was having an impact on the climate and something ought to be done about it. With approximately 195 countries involved, and it's a very acronym-laden area, and so there's some acronyms are provided for you on this slide. But the most important one in recent years really is the ADP, the Ad Hoc Working Group Durban Platform for Enhanced Action, that came out of COP17 in Durban, and that's the one that's been working towards the Paris Agreement. But the UNFCCC strengthened its agreement with the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, where that puts emission reduction commitments on developed countries within that agreement. And so one of the acronyms you will see, COPs are the meetings of all the parties to the UNFCCC, CMP is the parties to the Kyoto Protocol. And we'll have a new acronym at the end of this presentation as well from the Paris Agreement. And then where all the technical work gets done is the SBSTA, Subsidiary Body for Scientific and Technical Advice. Coming to the Kyoto Protocol then, which was the part of the UNFCCC, it had most countries involved, but not all, and with an emissions reduction commitments on developed countries. And really, if you can remember back to 2009 and the COP15 in Copenhagen, the big initiative and push there was for an agreement to agree something to replace the first period of the Kyoto Protocol. And of course, as we know, that failed in that objective. But what we did get in 2012, the COP18 in Doha, was an agreement on a second period of the Kyoto Protocol, although this lost some of the major emitting countries from it, so it was weaker. Where CCS comes into all of this? Well, back in the original Kyoto Protocol, Article 2.1, there's reference to it being used by developed countries as part of their mitigation efforts. And the way of being able to do that is provided for in the IPCC Greenhouse Gas Inventory Guidelines, and with a specific chapter from 2006 on CO2 injection and storage. That's for developed countries. For developing countries, the policy mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol was a clean development mechanism. This rewards projects, low carbon projects in developing countries. You're probably all familiar with it, but it did actually work well as a policy mechanism with over 7,000 projects stimulated by it, representing a lot of CO2. The CCS, just a quick reminder of how this is fitted in, and the story of CCS and the UNFCCC, in my mind, reflects the evidence base that's been provided on CCS. So first of all, we had the 2005 IPCC special report on CCS, which assessed and described that CCS could work at scale to make it worthwhile pursuing as a mitigation technology, but also some of the specific factors, such as the variability of the geological storage side, which needs specific regulations to make sure that that's done correctly. We then had a period of 5 years where CCS and CDM went through a lot of considerations, to and fro, workshops, inputs, and then there was a technical workshop in Abu Dhabi that the UNFCCC organised, where we were able to input a lot of technical information on the issues of concern, and that assisted with political support the agreement to get CCS and the CDM in COP17 in Durban. And that was very significant because it showed, with a new set of rules specific to CCS, a new set of specific modalities and procedures, that CCS could be done in developing countries in an environmentally sound way, maintaining the greenhouse gas integrity of it as an activity. And then what we've seen since then really is, and that moved on because we had more knowledge since the IPCC special report in 2005, some of the pilot projects, some of the main projects, and really the activity in UNFCCC since then has focused around benefiting and sharing the experiences and the learnings that we're getting from the larger scale projects. So we had a technology expert meeting in 2014 based on projects, and then from our own side, 2 side events at the recent COPs, also focusing on the project's experiences and learnings. So that's sort of bringing us up to almost to date, but one thing I think is very important to mention going into COP21, and this can't be overstated really, is the importance of the IPCC's 5th assessment report. Now, I'm sure you're all familiar with this. You know what this exercise represents. Every 7 years by the IPCC is a gathering of the brightest people on climate change, 800 authors, I think this time, 800 reviewers, 30,000 papers, peer-reviewed papers drawn upon to produce their conclusions, which cover climate change science, impacts and adaptation, but also mitigation efforts. So this was the synthesis report of those 3 reports was published in just before the COP20. And, you know, as you might expect, it reflects the growing emissions and where they're growing from, and that the energy sector is the main culprit to the greenhouse gas emissions, but also industry as well. But as we know, those tend to be large point sources that lend themselves to carbon capture and geological storage. So we can do something about those emissions in most of the cases. And what the 5th assessment report also did was recognise that the mitigation options exist already, many exist already today, including CCS, but also with an increased emphasis on bioenergy with CCS, because that's the negative emission technology. You're actually taking CO2 from the atmosphere with that combination of technologies. And we may have to do a lot of that in the future to get the emissions out of the atmosphere when our emissions scenarios are not achieving what they should be achieving. So those were messages that we've seen before, and these were more strongly reinforced in this, but the really important message is where they did a sensitivity analysis for the role of different low carbon technologies in meeting 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere by the year 2100. And they looked at the role of the different low carbon technologies, limiting bioenergy, limiting solar and wind, phasing out nuclear. And all of those, as you might expect, increase the costs of achieving 450 parts per million. And what was most surprising, though, was or significant, is that with taking out CCS, the cost rose by far the most, by 138% on average. And more significant than that, in the 11 model runs they did, the numbers in the cylinders there represent the number of model runs that were able to achieve 450 parts per million. Only four could achieve it without CCS. So CCS that's a very powerful message for the role of CCS. And as you can imagine, a lot of that comes from the role in industrial sectors where there's no low carbon alternative for decarbonising major energy intensive industries. In addition, thanks to our friends at the International Energy Agency in Paris, they update regularly their energy technology perspectives, looking at the contribution of technologies in the energy sector, and showing that we need all of the technologies to achieve the 2 degrees C target. They just look up to 2050, but it's important because it shows that going for this least cost solutions, we need all of the energy technologies really. And that just provides a comparative perspective across all of them. And their work also shows us that it's not just the electricity sector, but the industrial sector that I just mentioned, iron and steel, cement, etc., where CCS is very much needed. And also the need is spread around the world. It's not just developed countries, but also developing countries. And with the growth in their economies, they will need more CCS as well. So these were the expected inputs to COP21. We'd had these, but what came out just 2 weeks before COP21 was a new report from the UNFCCC called Climate Action Now. So the IPCC Fifth Assessment Report is looking to 2100, the IEA looked to 2050, but actually the UNFCCC reminds us we need to be taking more action now and before 2020. So they produced a high-level report that summarizes 6 main priority areas for action before 2020, and they actually did include CCUS as one of those priority areas. So that was a very good prompt and reminder that early action is possible on CCS and CCUS. So going up to COP21 in Paris, I think possibly the largest COP with 36,000 attendees, the largest COP in terms of area covered, certainly the highest number of world leaders in one place at any one time, 150 leaders at the beginning of it, and I must say very well organized, I think, by the French hosts as well, that really helped things progress, and a tremendous amount of work running up to it by the French hosts, working with all the governments of the world who were going to be there. So the ADP, and assisted by the French hosts, put in a tremendous amount of work to make COP21 have a substantial outcome. And they started, they had a draft text of some 36 pages or more, full of square brackets, as was what they went in with to the COP. And by the end of the 2 weeks, or 2 weeks and 2 days, they actually had an agreed text for the final outcomes and for the Paris Agreement. So what I'll do now is just run through in a brief summary of the outcomes then. And many others will be analysing these and have analysed them already, looking for the different perspectives and in different details. So this is just a quick run through from my perspective. First of all, the decision text that was agreed at the end of COP21 notes, and there's a new acronym here, the INDCs, Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. There's a significant gap between those that were submitted and the 2 degrees C, that's the political target. It calls for enhanced pre-2020 actions, building upon the nice Climate Action Now publication from the UNFCCC. Asked the IPCC to go back, because their fifth assessment report was looking at approximately the 2 degrees C scenario, but to look at the 1.5 degree scenario, and to do that by 2018. A decision to adopt the Paris Agreement itself, and the various other decisions that gave effect to different parts of the Paris Agreement on all of the areas that were needed to be covered, including mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, finance, technology development, capacity building, and a global stock take to take place early in 2018 as well as the main where we are and where we're heading. From our perspective, as IAGHG, we're very interested in the technology aspects, as our members would expect us to be, and so there the decision takes strengthen the technology mechanism that already exists, which is in two parts: the Technology Executive Committee and the Climate Technology Centre and Network. And IAGHG, we're very pleased to be a member of the network part of the Climate Technology Centre and Network. So strengthening the work that they do on technology research, development and demonstration, and development of indigenous capacities and technologies for developing countries, and also then to develop a technology framework by November 2016 to encourage the action and activities of the technology mechanism. So that's in the decision text. And in the Paris Agreement itself, which is an annex to the decision text, this is where you would have seen the headlines driven by this, that the overall objective of the agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees C, with an additional part to pursue achieving a limit of 1.5 degrees C. So that's very significant, and that really sets the political and policy agenda for everything else that follows in order to support and achieve that. But whereas the Kyoto Protocol was based upon legal obligations on developed countries to reduce emissions, this one is based, the Article 2 and the Paris Agreement is based upon more voluntary actions called pledges, and a pledge and review system on countries pledging their mitigation actions, and then a process to review those periodically. The objective is also to increase adaptation efforts, make sure there's finance to support all of this, and it continues this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, and also respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances, recognizing that countries are different, in particular the difference between developed and more developed countries and developing and less developed countries. So the operational part really is in Article 3 and Article 4 on mitigation actions. And what the UNFCCC managed to get in advance were these intended nationally determined contributions. And these INDCs, there was a deadline before the COP that many countries achieved, such that I think we had 187 INDCs submitted in the end, 185 before the COP, representing 94% of global emissions. And even within those, if you took all the existing policy promises, so to speak, they would have taken us, or would put us on an emissions trajectory to 3.6 degrees C by 2100. The new promises in the INDCs improved on that quite significantly onto a trajectory towards 2.7 degrees C, approximately, with error bounds on that, of course. But that was quite something to start with. Obviously, it's not 2 degrees C, which is the policy target, but it's an improvement on what we had before. Now, just out of interest, of those 187 INDCs, only 11 of those included CCS. But bearing in mind, these INDCs were meant to be representing countries' actions from 2020 to either 2025 or 2030. So early stage actions when obviously countries would be going for maybe lower hanging fruit, lower cost, low carbon alternatives, including energy efficiency and some of the renewable energy technologies. But this very important part of the Paris Agreement also calls for a peak in emissions as soon as possible, and then an interesting phrase around balancing, achieving a balance between emissions and sinks in the second half of this century. Again, with this point that developed countries should lead on actions, and developing countries should enhance their efforts over time, reflecting the common but differentiated responsibilities, etc. And these INDCs, in fact, in the Paris Agreement, they drop the I, the intended part, and they just become NDCs, nationally determined contributions. These have got to be updated then every 5 years, and this is the part that is the requirement. So whilst the level of mitigation activity in them is voluntary, is based upon, that's the pledge part, the reporting of these and the transparency is the part that's required. So these will be updated every 5 years, and each one has to represent a progression on the previous one from that country. So that's looking hopeful then that things will improve from the 2.7 degrees trajectory that we may be on now if everybody acted on what they pledged in their current INDCs. Briefly through the other parts of it, Article 6 is a mechanism for internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. And the general understanding is that this is to allow for some form of new carbon trading mechanism, or actions that can be shared, and the benefits can be shared between countries, basically. So this could well be the carbon markets part or market mechanisms part of the Paris Agreement. All the details on that are to be determined and worked through and developed in subsequent meetings, of course. So we don't know much about how that will look at the moment. Article 7 looks at actions on adaptation. Article 8 continues, and adaptation is obviously very important, especially for less developed countries. Article 8, continuing the work on loss and the principles around loss and damage. Article 9 is very important because it's to facilitate and encourage the funding to enable actions to take place in developing countries. And the $100 billion per year that was previously been agreed, this is moves that, extends that from being just there in place by 2020, but moving it, extending it up to 2025, and then with review after that as well. So financial provisions provided for as well, and then just sort of reflecting what, in a lesser form, what was in the decision text. Article 10 is on technology development and transfer. By the way, these are my headings in bold, in inverted commas. They're not the ones provided in the document. These are just my summaries of what each article is about. And this says the same basically about creating a technology framework to provide overarching guidance to the technology mechanism in promoting technology development and transfer, and in particular to strengthen collaborative approaches to research and development. That's something obviously that IAGHG, that's our core area of activity. So again, there's very little detail in this at the moment. It's technology neutral, and we will wait to see on how this develops as the technology framework has some meat put on these bones, and we'll pay very close attention to this area. The rest of the Paris Agreement, Article 11 covers capacity building, Article 12 covers education, Article 13 is very important on transparency. Article 14 starts this stocktake process that looks at INDCs and the overall climate objectives, and this will be every 5 years, starting from 2023. And there was the decision text also had an earlier, effectively a stocktake in 2018 as well. And then the new acronym, 2 new acronyms for us in this acronym-laden world, CMA. So instead of COP and CMP, we've got CMA, and that's Conference of the Parties, serving as a meeting of the parties to the agreement. So CMA meetings, look out for those being added to the next COP is COP22. And the Durban platform, the ADP, that's done such good work in developing this Paris Agreement, the job of that is done, and that is disbanded. but the work that continues to develop the detail on the Paris Agreement will be the ad hoc working group on the Paris Agreement, which is the APA. And all of this enters into force when 55 countries ratify it, representing 55% or more of global emissions. Thanks to IISD for this photograph of the concluding moments of the COP. I think people are very pleased, obviously, because Copenhagen failed so badly, and here they do have an agreement with 195 countries reaching this agreement, and that's quite a considerable achievement by anyone's measure. Our role in all of this is very modest. Our role is just providing some technical information into the process through the mechanisms that the UNFCCC provide. And so what we did for this COP21 was organise a side event on carbon capture and storage, achievements and opportunities for developing country involvement. And we were very pleased to get this because by collaborating with our colleagues at the University of Texas, with the CCSA, with CO2 GeoNet, we were able to get this side event when there were over 800 applications for the 150 side event places. And the theme of our side event really was both marking the progress with Boundary Dam, the technical progress there, but also the potential collaboration opportunities coming out of that through their knowledge centre. And we were very pleased that we had the Honourable Brad Wall, Premier of Saskatchewan, who came to give a political perspective on that project as well as the CEO of SaskPower, Mike Marsh. But we also looked at the potential for offshore storage of CO2 with the University of Texas and Catherine Romanak. And of course, here in our own backyard, so to speak, in the North Sea, we have 20 years of CCS through Statoil. And Philip Ringrose talked about that with the Sleipner project and Snøhvit and their other activities. 20 years and 20 million tonnes of CO2 through CCS. And then actually what was very useful as well was the CO2 GeoNet. Ton Wildenberg spoke about European pilot projects on CCS, which is useful because countries who are new and first looking at CCS may not want to jump into the large-scale projects immediately, but start with test and pilot and small-scale projects. And the EU has good experience with those. And all of this was brought with the developing country context, and the director of CTCN, Jukka Uusakanainen, also presented on their role in assisting developing countries to take part in activities such as the ones described in our side event. So this was actually the main CCS side event that the UNFCCC supported at the COP. There were other side events by GCCSI, IEA, CO2 GeoNet, but this was the main UNFCCC one. And we were very pleased with the way that the event was covered by IISD, and that's the website if you want to see their coverage of it. The PowerPoints were also available on the UNFCCC website. And we were also pleased that the Japanese NHK World News came and did a television article on the event as well that they made available for a month afterwards on their website. So the main purpose of doing this is providing information, and people come along if they're interested in CCS, and we were very pleased that we had a very strong attendance at the side event. I think it was possibly the largest side event on CCS in my experience at COPs. But also that's for people who are available at that particular point in time. It's important to make information available throughout the COPs, and you're able to do this through the exhibit booths. And we again collaborated with others on one inside the negotiation area, so with the University of Texas, CO2 GeoNet and CCSA. So we had one inside for delegates from the countries, and that was very busy and a nice level of interest coming through that. But this COP was unusual in that it had a public arena as well, specifically aimed at the public, the climate generation area. And CO2 GeoNet really organised this, and we were very happy to join in with them and the Global CCS Institute and CCSA, University of Texas, to have some CCS information in the public area as well. And all through, I think there was a steady stream of information. And one thing that I noticed on reflection was that the nature of the questions that we were receiving, both in the side event and at the booth, had changed. And people had stopped really sort of challenging whether we need CCS at all, but were more asking, okay, so how do we do it? So that, obviously that's a sweeping generalization from my personal perspective, but others did comment recognizing the same change in a positive sort of engagement from people seeking information. So I think it's very important that organizations such as ourselves and the Global CCS Institute, CO2 GeoNet, University of Texas, and CCSA are there providing this information. And it was also, we intended that the International Journal for Greenhouse Gas Control special issue, marking 10 years on since the IPCC special report, that special issue was timed to be produced in time for this COP, and we made that available at this booth as well, representing the technical developments in those 10 years. So that was our very modest contribution to the overall bigger picture that was far more important. And I'll just one last topic to cover just very briefly before we end, and I look at any questions that we've got, is the topic of unburnable carbon and the role of CCS. So this is a concept around that if we have an ambitious climate agreement, in terms of the fossil fuel reserves that are in the ground, not all of those can be used and emitted, and the greenhouse gases from their use emitted. So therefore, people say that there is this concept of unburnable carbon. Some of the fossil fuels has to stay in the ground, maybe between a third to a half has to stay in the ground. And that means you end up with stranded assets, and there is concern because people worry about the valuation of fossil fuel producing companies if they can't use all their reserves, and the value is based upon their reserves. So this concept of the carbon bubble exists. So this has sort of come up in the last 2 years, really. The Bank of England's looking at it through its Financial Policy Committee, looking at the risks of the financial markets and the financial stability. And in fact, at COP21 inside, there were at least 2 events that talked around this area. One again with Mark Carney from the Bank of England on climate change risk to financial markets. And he created a new task force on climate disclosure around such risks to financial assets. And one with Al Gore contributing to it on carbon asset risk. So it's getting notice and traction and some assessment. And as a technical organisation, we thought we should look at the role of CCS in this area because a few papers had been published, but we've commissioned, and we're very pleased to be working with the Sustainable Gas Institute at Imperial College London to do a quick first look at this role of CCS in unburnable carbon. That work, we are still to publish that yet, but the initial conclusions of that work, they reinforce about how the carbon budget erodes quickly if fossil fuel reserves are used and emitted, but that the role of CCS is significant, particularly from 2030, 2040 onwards, up to 2100. The Sustainable Gas Institute and the Imperial College people looked at the work that the IPCC had done in the 5th assessment report, at the energy models in that, for the role of CCS. So they were taking their energy modeling data and from that got an assessment of how much CCS is going to be required. The simple conclusions are, for the amount of fossil fuel reserves that we know at the moment, there is certainly the static CO2 storage capacity available in the world on a simplistic side. It's different if you look at the dynamic storage, which is less than the static storage capacity, but that means we need to do more work in the future looking at pressure and brine management, for example, to make better use of storage and improve storage efficiency. So the overall point that come out of this is, even with the different perspectives and different scenarios, CCS does enable access to significant quantities of fossil fuels in a 2 degrees C world. And we hope to publish this later on this year. So what next from all of this? Well, obviously from COP21 and the Paris Agreement, we've got a strong political and policy message on climate change. People will be watching and assessing on how countries turn their promises into actions, on how they deliver what they've promised in the INDCs, for example, and the reporting process and transparency is very important in that as it goes forward. There's a lot of work to be done now on developing the details and the rules and modalities, etc. And that will be the work of the subsequent UNFCCC meetings. We have the SUBSTA meeting in May, and we have COP22, which will be in Morocco, in Marrakesh, in mid-November later on this year. Unfortunately, coinciding with the second week of that, coinciding with our own conference in Switzerland. The IPCC will undertake further work, as they've been mandated to look at the 1.5 degrees C objective. And the technical expert meetings will continue. I think they're changing their title to technical examination meetings. And in the SUBSTA in May in Bonn, there will be one of those on adaptation and one on mitigation, details to be established yet. And of course, the NDCs themselves will be updated on this frequent basis of every 5 years. And as that process works through, countries will probably consider whether CCS is applicable to their national circumstances. We do know that storage potential for CO2 in geological structures is extensive around the world, and many countries have this potential but haven't started assessing it yet. And so we probably expect to see more interest in CCS, particularly when further mitigations actions will be required if 1.5 degrees C is to be pursued. For more information, obviously the UNFCCC website is a vast wealth of information, and also the IISD website for their reporting on the conclusions and all the other activities. So that's what's going to be happening next, the details and everything really to be worked through following this high-level political and policy message out of COP21. Some of this will be discussed, I'm sure, and the implications of it will be presented and discussed at our own conference, GHGT 13 in Lausanne in Switzerland, 14th to the 18th of November. And then just to mention two other activities that we've got coming up, the International Workshop on Offshore Geologic CO2 Storage at the University of Texas in Austin, coming from a CSLF report on offshore storage potential, working with SANEDI from South Africa and CSLF supported, I think will be of use to those countries. And we did get interest from the COP from countries there who are now, some countries are starting to look at their offshore storage potential, and we welcome those to this workshop. It's aimed specifically at them. And also our own research networks, our monitoring network and modelling network, are meeting in Edinburgh, hosted by BGS and the Scottish Centre for CCS in Edinburgh in the first week of July. So thank you for listening, and I'm very happy to take questions.
Well, Tim, thank you very much. It's not easy to summarise 2 very intense weeks down into 40 minutes, but we do have a few questions for you. When you were discussing the side event and the booth that we had, were there any specific inquiries from the developing world?
Well, there were a large range of inquiries from developing countries. A lot around how do we start to assess our potential for CCS, but also getting more technical and more specific depending on where they were on the learning curve. I can't really think of any specific examples, but the general inquiries that were received at the booths were from developing countries, which I thought was very healthy.
Okay, well, there was a follow-up, which I think you've sort of just touched on there, which was which developing country showed most interest in developing CCS?
Well, obviously there's the ones that we know of are already doing it and planning to do it and significantly underway, such as China, Brazil, South Africa, South Korea. But countries were coming forward with who hadn't really looked at it before, such as Nigeria, who have strong potential. They've got fossil energy power industries, they've got offshore oil and gas. And so that was very interesting as one example.
Okay, I think this could be a little bit of a leading question.
Yeah.
What do the general outcomes from Paris mean for CCS moving forward?
Okay, so I think because all of the agreements, I think because CCS has been generally accepted since 2011 when it got into the CDM, it's there, it's considered, it's in the mitigation options that the UNFCCC put in their own Climate Action Now report. I think it means that more of everything, actually. So one, it firms up the analysis that's been done by the IPCC and the IEA around the 2 degrees C target. But with this introduction of the 1.5 degrees C as to be pursued, that will mean more mitigation activities across the board, across sectors, across technologies. So it's all technology neutral in the Paris Agreement. So we would hope for more mitigation actions across all the technologies, including CCS.
Okay, Tim, thank you. And another question on the side event. So what kind of response did you actually receive during the side event?
These things are always slightly uncertain. You can plan as well as you can for them, but the actual attendance and attendees are self-selecting, so you're subject to what's other influences at the time. But we were very pleased that we were given a room of 200 people capacity for the UNFCCC, and it appeared to be full with people standing at the back. So we took that to be a very good response in terms of participants. The questions were engaged and inquiring, and with a positive engagement in them. And the questions didn't stop at the end of our time. And in fact, the questions continued afterwards outside, and the media continued their, undertook interviews afterwards as well as before. They also continued afterwards. So we thought that was quite good feedback on the side event.
Okay. I think jumping subject very slightly, if the CDM has been successful in the past, how likely is it to be significantly changed in the next iteration?
Okay, well that really is $1,000 question. I would need a crystal ball to answer that one. One would assume that they'll take the best parts of the CDM and learn from the way it worked and incorporate those into any new mechanism. But really the work is yet to start on that. So anything I would say would be just purely speculative.
Okay, I think we'll move on to the very last question that we've actually got time for. This has just come through. Do we have the complete set of the quantified NDCs for all 187 countries, and are they accessible?
Okay, well, in theory they're accessible on the UNFCCC website. I don't know the exact address, but each one is there. I'm assuming all 187 are there because that's the number that's been quoted that have been submitted, and they're publicly available. They're available as PDFs. They're fairly brief documents, some of them, and as I said before, 11 of them include explicitly CCS, and we would expect, as they're adapted and improved and updated, more potentially to include CCS in the future.
Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for today. I'd just like to thank you for sharing your thoughts and your summary on this webinar today. And
okay.
We hope you'll join us for our next event.
Okay, thank you very much.